Our guest in the studio today has a petite stature, but is a huge presence to her patients and their families in the Grand Rapids community. Dr. Simin Beg is a palliative care physician who joins us to talk about life and death and all the nuanced spaces in between. Simin, welcome to Feel Like You Belong.
Thank you so much.
So we were talking earlier and you were telling me a little bit about your family's immigration history.
Yeah.
Your family came from Pakistan and settled originally on the West Coast. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, my father, when he was young, was recruited by a university in Missouri to come to the United States for further education. So he migrated many years, 40 years ago actually, with my mother, and me and my sister, we were just young at the time. So he was here, built a family, my parents had more children, and the plan was to go back, but that never really happened. However, as we got older, my sisters and I started going back to Pakistan because it was really important for my father, for us to stay connected to our roots. And so we went to school there, spent half our time in Pakistan, half our time in the United States. That varied, you know, and that we grew up doing that until I came here to do residency in Grand Rapids and ended up staying.
So did you do your medical training in Pakistan?
I did,
Okay.
I did. Went to medical school there. My mother became ill, and so there was a hiatus between medical school and residency, but ultimately did my residency here in Grand Rapids in internal medicine.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So you, in your heart, in your soul, do you feel bicultural? Because you sound completely bilingual.
Yeah.
And we were doing a test check in Urdu earlier. Yeah. Do you feel very comfortably bilingual, bicultural?
Oh, I do. You know, growing up, my sisters and I, because we spent our time divided between United States and Pakistan, in some ways we didn't belong anywhere, because no matter where we went, we were the foreign children. But on the other hand, we sort of belonged in both places. It allowed us to create our own identity and kind of take the good parts from both cultures and understand them both completely. So not only am I bilingual, I also am very comfortable in both cultures, stemming from the fact that I never belonged in either one. So it's kind of a paradox, but it worked out really well.
Sure. So when you're back in Pakistan, do people treat you differently? Like, oh, you're sort of Americanized, or?
You know, language is a very powerful connector. So when you can speak the language and you understand the nuances of a culture, you sort of belong. You know, that's a one way to belong. So when I go back to Pakistan, I know what it's like to live there. I can speak the language, and that helps me connect on a very deep level. Same is true for here. But at the same time, again, I speak English differently than most Pakistanis do. And even sometimes when I speak Urdu, it's a little bit different as well. So again, in some ways I belong in both places, and in some ways I don't belong in either.
Sure, sure. And there's something that as we become more global and more of us become really citizens of the world, it just reminds us nobody really owns English and any language.
Right.
You know.
And that's one of the things that I find that this concept of global citizenship is really true for everyone. I mean, we grew up truly in two cultures, but that's true for those who've only been in the United States. We are all global citizens, whether we like it or not.
So now, did you do high school here or there?
In Pakistan.
Okay.
All of my elementary and then high school, medical school was in Pakistan, and then did my residency here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you came here to do another round of training, you know, what was the impetus to come, especially to Grand Rapids?
Grand Rapids had a great internal medicine residency program, which was attractive to me. We had actually never lived in the Midwest, so I was very nervous. I shouldn't say that on TV, but I am. I was very nervous.
Use the S word, which sounds like snow.
I was nervous about that. I didn't know if I was going to belong. I had heard things about the community's very tight, and you know, the intention was to come, train, and leave. Well, this community just really roped me in. I fell in love with the community. We did. My kids were little, and we raised the kids here. And now we'll probably stay for the foreseeable future. It's a great place to raise kids and a great place to practice medicine.
Sure, sure. I want to talk about your job in just a moment, but we were talking about your kids. What is it like to raise kids bilingually, biculturally, when you're surrounded by English and USA?
If you were to ask my children, they probably don't even realize that they're being raised any differently than anybody else. Your reality becomes the norm. As a parent, though, I do find it challenging, especially in the current, political condition. I find that sometimes labels are brought out more readily, and children lack inhibition for a variety of reasons, and so sometimes I think it is a little more challenging. But I really see it as a great opportunity for the kids because they understand things that I did not understand at that age. They're aware of the world in a way that I was not. And sometimes it makes me feel sad. I think, boy, these children that are being raised now, they're being raised with a burden. But I think for the most part, it's a great opportunity for them to be a part of the global community, if you will, too, from such an early age.
Do you speak Urdu at home?
It depends on what I'm doing.
Okay.
If when I'm tired, Urdu comes to mind.
Okay.
I sometimes translate in my head. If I get nervous, I start to think in Urdu, so forgive me. But there are some things I dream in both languages.
Okay.
My kids are not that fluent, so for them, English is definitely their
So they
their
probably
primary
need
language.
a summer back home at Grandma and Grandpa camp to refresh those
We were in
skills.
Pakistan 2 years ago, and the kids did quite well. The kids are very resilient that way, much more than adults are. So
Sure.
they were able to communicate quite well.
Sure. I want to go back and talk about your work because your original training is in internal medicine, but you specialize in palliative care.
Yeah.
So first of all, palliative care isn't something that everyone is familiar with. Talk about that as a specialty and what about that appeals to you?
Palliative care is a branch of medicine that focuses on comfort, symptoms, quality of life. And it appeals to me because, in my mind, that is what every physician should be doing. We should be focusing on who our patients are, what their symptoms are, what does quality of life mean to them, and then providing them with medical care that fits that definition. So the fact that here there was a subspecialty that focused on the very philosophy that makes sense to me just inherently was very appealing. I've been doing hospice and palliative care. Hospice is palliative care, but that's for end of life for 7 years now, and I will probably never leave that.
Now, a lot of people would be really scared and say, "Oh, that's grim, that's scary. I couldn't do that." What's the appeal to you, and why? And help us understand why some people do this.
Culturally, we are adverse to death. And that is something that it's sad, but it is a reality. It is not something that we can avoid. It doesn't matter what illness you have. It is something that everyone is going to face. I really like end of life because it's an opportunity for me to see all individuals the same. No matter where you're from, what religion you are, what you practice, what your ethnic background is, we all go through that end of life phase. And to be truthful, most of the struggles in end of life phase, doesn't matter what your cultural background is, are also very similar. And to me, providing comfort and dignity and autonomy during that time is uplifting, not demoralizing. It doesn't depress me. It makes me feel good about my work. It makes me feel good about my community.
And you're really helping guide both the patient and their family through this process.
And it's holistic, so we're not just focused on the disease. A lot of times I will get to know my patients better. What do they find quality of life? Because it's sort of like ordering dinner, right? You order what is appealing to you, and that's different for everyone. So one of my patients may say, you know, I really want to go to the casino. And we think, okay, how can we do that? It's a very uplifting type of medicine from my perspective.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. Now, you are a practicing Muslim.
I am.
And you have the chance to take care of patients from all faith practices, but you told me a very touching story about one particular Christian couple. Can you share that?
Yeah, this was a individual whose wife was dying from cancer at a very young age. She was actually my age at the time with young children. They were very devout Christians, and he was well known in the Christian community as well, very active. She was my patient, and they had really been focusing on their faith to help them get through this time, which, you know, makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
But I had not had a conversation with the husband of my patient, you know, and so one day I asked him, I said, you know, would you like for us to talk about the condition of your wife and kind of where we see this going? And we went outside, and he was devastated, as you can imagine. And he sat on the curb and was crying because of his reality. And all of a sudden, he looked at me and said, "Do you believe in God?" And I felt a little nervous. I thought, oh, where is this conversation going? But okay. I said, "I do." And then he said, "Are you a Christian?" And I thought, here's a man who's losing his young wife with young kids. If he needs to believe that the physician caring for them is a Christian to make him feel better, I'm fine with that. So I had intended to say, I am. But when I opened my mouth, I said, no, I am not. And he stopped dead and just looked at me straight in the eye. And then he asked me, what religion do you practice? And once again, my intention was to say something, you know, vague and say, that's not relevant. And instead, I said, I am a Muslim. But I saw the look of confusion and maybe even a little fear on his face. And my heart just broke. And I said to him, I said, if you feel more comfortable with somebody of a different religious background, I most certainly can help find another physician for you. And he stayed quiet for about another 30 seconds and looked at me and said, no, I'd like for you to stay my wife's physician. And I got teary. He got teary. And in that moment, it was more than just medicine that was happening there. In my mind, I thought he needed me to be a certain way to provide him comfort. And perhaps he did too. And thank goodness that my mind doesn't always follow my heart. But I realized that we shared something in spite of belonging to different religions, and we could connect. We didn't have to be the same to connect.
And he may have sensed something deeply spiritual about you, because we can't help but just project who we are. And sometimes, happily, our hearts are speaking when our devious little minds are trying to manipulate the outcome.
So that gave me a lot of comfort, you know, and it made me realize that as long as we create a space for those that are different from who we are, a space that's safe, a space that's respectful, and a space that's curious and not critical, it doesn't really matter what label we put on. You know, we all share the same hopes, dreams, aspirations, fears, griefs, because we're all people. And that was a realization for me. I thought I had to be a certain way to connect with somebody from his background.
And I think when we're in the helping professions, whether it's healthcare or education, we kind of have this assumption that we're in charge, we're the ones doling out, you know, wisdom and care, and in fact, so many times we're the true recipients.
The truth of the matter is, I get more often than not far more from my patients and their families than I give to them. It's part of why I love my job.
Sure. Now, one way that Muslims across the world and in the United States are publicly identifiable is that women often cover. You've chosen not to. Can you talk a little bit about what that means with your current understanding?
Sure. My perspective, and perhaps many it will share this view, is that religion is a journey, and it's a very personal journey. You know, part of it is influenced by your parents, how you grow up, your experiences, your understanding. I was just saying yesterday that every time I read the Quran, it's a different book to me because I understand it differently. My father, as we were being raised, talked about modesty as, because that's a very important value in Islam. And the modesty extends from not just what you wear, but how you think, how you behave, how you talk. The modesty is applied to your body, your mind, your spirit. So we really took that, my sisters and I, we really took that from my father and continue to apply that. As far as covering, that is something that perhaps I even strive to do someday. But it's a journey, you know, and at what point, if I'm ever going to do that, what that would be, I really can't say. I will say, though, that I don't believe that anybody is better or worse for doing something like that, because like I said, I believe it to be a very personal thing.
It's easy for all of us as human beings to jump in and get a little judgmental
It
about
is.
those other people.
Well, my job teaches me that all the time.
Absolutely. We're going to have to wrap up in just a minute, but I want to conclude with, these are some very trying times in the United States.
They are indeed.
And recently there is resurrected talk about travel bans to a number of countries, including your native land. What does that mean, both practically for someone who has dozens of friends and loved ones still there that you would like to visit, and emotionally? What are those two?
You know, the practicalities are probably easier to talk about, and I'm not going to go into the details of them because you can certainly get all of those practicalities from the news and, you know, credible sources. I think that the bigger impact that I see is the emotional impact. Certainly the practical impacts you cannot deny. The emotional impact is one of uncertainty and fear, even perhaps. You know, some of the young teenagers in our community had questions like, are you going to get deported? What's going to happen to our families? Even though that's really not something that we would expect to happen. But the fact that there is a circumstance in which Muslims, particularly Muslims coming from those countries, are feeling insecure and afraid, really disturbs me greatly, and I worry about that. I worry about that for my children. I worry about that for Muslim youth. I worry about that for the non-Muslim youth. This is a harmful way for our community to feel, whether you're Muslim or not.
Sure, sure. And I think that for so many of us, wherever we are living and whatever faith practice we have, whatever educational background is, we're looking for where can we make connections, where can we belong.
Yeah.
And if all of a sudden there are these walls going up, the communication is, no, you don't belong. So let me just say, as host of the show and a champion for belonging, you are an asset to this community, and continued success in your work, because you're doing very important things. And however we can be of help to you, please reach out and do that.
Oh, thank you. It is such an honor to be a part of this community.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And people who are watching, thank you for joining us. If you're watching on TV, stay with us for some tips on American English, culture, and humor. For our friends on the internet, we'll hope you'll join our ongoing conversation with the impressive immigrants who contribute their vast skills to making the United States a better place.